The W210 from the factory has separate spring and shocks, which some people may or may not like, but there's one benefit to having separate springs and shocks, and that's being able to fine tune the height of the car with spring pads. So where the spring sits on the spring perch, there'll be a little rubber pad like this on the top of it, and these have different heights. So you can actually raise and lower the car just by replacing this part right here, and it is relatively inexpensive to change them out. Right now my car sits on number 3 pads up front, and I'm going to change them to number 5s. I want to show you the height difference. So these spring pads range from number 1 pads to number 5 pads, and the way you can tell is these little dots right here. So you see this one has 5 dots, so it's a number 5 spring pad being the thickest one. So I'll post up on the screen a screenshot of what the spring pads are. So it ranges from number 1 to number 5 on the front and number 1 and number 4 on the back. There's different part numbers, there's different thicknesses. I'll list all of them in the screenshot. So I'm going to be changing the spring pads in the front of this car from a number 3 to a number 5. I'm going to leave the rear alone. It's at number 1 right now, but because this is a wagon with self-leveling rear suspension, I can adjust the SLS rod to change it high on the rear. So I will be doing that as well to match the front, but let's just take a look at what it is before. So there's a lot of ways people measure height, and the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to kind of stay in the same spot right here. So for the before and after, we'll be in the same spot. I'll be measuring from the bottom of the tire right here, going through the center to the top of the fender. Some people like to measure from the center of the center cap to the fender, but I'll do both. All right, so here we are going through the center of the center cap, and you can see the measurement. So what is that, about 64 centimeters at the center of the center cap to the fender, 34 centimeters. So here I'll try to pause it right there. You can see if it's, you can see the measurement in inches as well. All right, so now I'm going to swap out the spring pad, which requires complete removal of the spring. All right, so here is the spring removed from the car. This is absolutely required to change the spring pad. The spring pad will sit on the very top of the spring. So that's the only way to get it out, and you will need the special spring compressor tool. It's the telescoping one that goes through a center with these 2 little pancakes. Use the correct tool, otherwise you are at high risk of hurting yourself. So here are the spring pads, and they are different. So we'll see that's a number 3 and that's a number 5, so it's a little bit thicker. Once again, the dimensions will be posted, but this will give you a little bit of extra height if you need it. Or you can go lower if that's your goal. Here is the car on the ground in the same spot after swapping to number 5 spring pads. There's a noticeable difference in height in my opinion. So if we measure from the bottom of the tire going through the center of the wheel to the top of the fender, looks like we're at about 26 inches from the center of the center cap to the top of the tire, about 14 inches or a little under. All right, so here's the final stance of the car. This is on the number 5 spring pad up front. So we had the number 3 on before. You can see 3 dots. It is listed as 17 millimeters thick. So we went to the number 5. See 5 dots. This is listed as 21 millimeters thick. Quite a big difference in person. So the difference between this 8 millimeters is about 0.3 inches. When I measured, it looked like it gained 0.5. So that's just my experience. Of course, your results will probably vary depending on wheel and tire, the ground you're measuring on, and a bunch of other stuff. Going from a 3 to a 5, I did gain the height I wanted. I didn't want to be super low. So you can also kind of consider that if you're going lower from a 5 to a 3 or a 3 to a 1 or whatever. So yeah, just take a look at that chart. The front and rear is listed about at the same thickness. The front, they do make a number 5 pad. The rear, they do not. They go up to 4 in the rear, 1 being the thinnest, 5 being the thickest. So from what I noticed when I went to the 5 spring pad, the front actually does ride a lot better. I don't know if it's just due to height or because there's extra rubber to absorb the impact of the road, but it does ride better. Of course, everyone's tastes and preferences will be different. I want to go higher. Most people want to go lower. You can do that for the front and the rear. If you have a car with self-leveling rear suspension, like a US wagon, like this car, come factory with self-leveling rear, you will have to adjust the SLS rod in the back to get the height you want. So this car actually has a number 1 pad in the back, so it could go really low. But when the SLS is pressurized, it goes to a set height, which that's the height I set it at. So I could actually go a lot lower. So if you do have SLS, just keep that in mind. You'll have to adjust the rod for the valve. So this car is on AMG Euro springs. This is on H&R V8 springs, and this is on number 3 pads. So thinner pad, but because the spring's different, it sits different. So it's a little bit higher than that car. And then I got number 1 pads in the back of here as well on the H&R springs. The shocks will not make a difference in height on these cars at all. If you have a 4MATIC, it's different, so don't pay attention to this if it's a 4MATIC. But the shocks on a rear-wheel drive 210 do not affect the height at all, 0. You can actually take the shocks off the car and it won't make a difference in the height, except if you have SLS. So if you just have the standard shocks on a sedan, you're not gonna play with the height with the shocks. So you can get these spring pads online. I'm sure there's a bunch of different retailers like auto parts sellers like FCP Euro, Pelican Parts, Auto House, AZ, stuff like that. You could buy them from the dealer. They should run about 10 bucks each. So prices will vary, of course, but that's what I ended up paying, was 10 bucks each. And just make sure you get the proper tool to remove the spring. It is very dangerous to work with those springs without the proper tools. The proper tool made this job fairly easy. So the spring pads can go from as little as 5 millimeters to all the way up to 21 with the number 5 pad. It's fairly minimal adjustment, but it is something nonetheless. It's better than nothing. Honestly, doing this to me is easier than having coilovers. I had coilovers on my sedan, and you had to pretty much take the spring out to adjust it anyway. Of course, there's more adjustability. You could go way higher or way lower, but to me, I kind of like it around this height. I rather do this than coilovers. Is a lot easier. This is my 124. It also uses spring pads. They're just a little different. They're just different part numbers, but basically same concept, except these go 1 through 4 front and back. This is on number 4 pads with H&R springs. The springs will play a difference actually on the 124 because there's no upper control arm. The shock also acts as an upper control arm, which also affects the height. So the shock on a 124 will affect the height, but not on a 210. So I'll post the specs of these spring pads in the description, as well as the part numbers to all of them front and back for the W210. Of course, there are different part numbers for 202, 208, stuff like that. So if you Google them, you can find the information pretty easily. So I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you for watching.